Kristin Sanderson has been the interpretive park ranger at Fort Churchill State Historic Park in Buckland Station for 9 years. She is a proud fourth-generation Nevadan. She was born and raised in Sparks and has stayed true to her Western roots, living, working, and attending school in Montana, California, New Mexico, Nevada, and Arizona. Kristin has a bachelor's degree in environmental studies from Carroll College in Helena, Montana, a master's degree in environmental education from California State University in San Bernardino, and a certificate in Parks and Recreation Management from Northern Arizona University. I'm getting a little nervous because there's a word coming up that I actually spelled out, so I won't mess it up, but I'm already worried, and so I'm messing up everything else. Okay, an interpretive park ranger since 2003, Kristin has had the privilege of working in many beautiful and diverse places, including Yosemite National Park, Chiricahua National Monument, Lake Mead National Recreation Area, Santa Fe National Forest, and Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area. Kristin believes that connecting individuals with state parks and public lands through education and interpretation helps them form lasting attitudes of appreciation, understanding, and responsibility. Please welcome Kristin Sanderson.
Thank you, Jennifer, and good evening. It's a privilege to be here tonight to talk with you about one of my favorite places in Nevada. And in the spirit of games and trivia, Fort Churchill just happens to be Nevada's first, largest, and most expensive frontier fort. Fort Churchill has a really rich and complex human history. And to try and talk about all of those layers, all of those nuances of its human history would take days, weeks, and I'm guessing most of you don't have that time available this week. So we're going to do a condensed version of about 163 years of history. And because Fort Churchill's history is so rich and complex, I like to compare its history to a puzzle. Each intricate piece is interesting and worth exploring in and of itself, but it's only when you put those pieces together that you get a more complete picture or a thorough understanding of the area's remarkable history. And so tonight, on the table here in front of you, I have a number of objects. And each of these objects represents a piece of Fort Churchill's history. We're going to talk about each of those pieces briefly, and then we're going to weave or put all of those pieces together to talk about Fort Churchill's overall history. So this is our roadmap to this evening. And we do have, I believe, some time for questions at the end. So if you do have questions throughout the evening, I want to hear those. I want an opportunity to be able to talk with you more about Fort Churchill. So hang on to those, and we'll have an opportunity at the end to address those questions. Figuring out where to start when talking about Fort Churchill's history can be a challenge. Depends how far in time you want to go back. Are we talking human history, geologic history? I always like to start with one particular date when talking about Fort Churchill, and that date is 1848. And something was discovered in California that would forever change the history of the West as we know it. And I wasn't intending to turn this into a trivia evening, but why not? In the spirit of fun, why not? So, can anybody tell me what that discovery is or was? Collectively, it sounds like gold. You're absolutely right. And I know it's hard to see as you're sitting there in the audience, but we have a symbol of that piece of Fort Churchill's history, a vial of placer gold. So January 1848, gold was discovered near Sacramento, California. And in the year that followed that discovery, 1849, a wave of European American immigrants traveled across the United States into the gold fields of California. They came from all parts of the country, they came from all walks of life, but they came with the same hope and dream of striking it rich in those gold fields and forever changing their fortunes and their futures. Those gold seekers that traveled in 1849 became known as 49ers. And this would be the first of a handful of waves of immigrants that would make their way through our Great Basin Desert. 10 years after gold was discovered in California, another discovery was made, this time closer to home. The year was 1859. What was discovered right here in our own backyard? Silver ore was discovered near Virginia City, and it created a second wave or rush of European American immigrants into and through this region. And it's worth noting that in the years following the discovery of gold and silver, between 1841 and 1869, more than 200,000 European American immigrants followed the California Trail through this region. Which leads me really to the next piece of our puzzle. You see a wagon sitting here on the table in front of you, and that represents immigrant travel through our region. Those individuals that came west following the discovery of gold and later the discovery of silver, they were following well-established roads or routes across the country. Collectively, those routes are known as the immigrant trails, and one of them just happened to pass right through the area that would be developed as Fort Churchill. That was the Carson route of the California Trail. And again, these are the wagon roads that brought those immigrants west across the country following those discoveries. In the footsteps of those immigrants came some advancements in technology. It's worth noting that a lot of those immigrants, they left behind friends and family in other parts of the country. And even though they were separated by hundreds of miles, they wanted to be able to send and receive news and information, especially from their loved ones. And so, communication, there were regional demands for communication to connect the various parts of our vast country. And so we had two early forms of communication that would shape the Fort Churchill area. I'll pose the question to you. What was the earliest form of communication to connect what would become Fort Churchill to the rest of the country? Pony Express, and you see that represented here tonight with our horse and with the advertisement for Pony Express riders. But the Pony Express was our country's first cross-country mail delivery service, in which young men would ride on the back of a horse to deliver mail. The route traveled between St. Joseph, Missouri in the east and Sacramento, California in the west, a distance of nearly 2,000 miles. And in order to make this ambitious endeavor successful, it required many things: hundreds of horses, dozens of riders, and numerous stations along the route. Just trying to decide how much detail to go into. I told you this would be an overview. However, each of these pieces of Fort Churchill's history is worth exploring in and of itself. So I think if you don't mind, I'll go into a little bit more detail about the Pony Express. I mentioned hundreds of horses, dozens of riders, and numerous stage stops. There were different types of stage stops along the route. This was an example of a relay system. Those horses were traveling hard and fast, and so they could only travel certain distances each day. Every 10 to 15 miles, you would find home stations. This is where you would change horses. Every 75 to 100 miles, you would find home stations. This is where you would change riders. And in this way, using all of that infrastructure, they were able to transport mail across the country in 10 days or less. And part of what made that mail delivery service so iconic was how they delivered the mail. Obviously, it was done by horse, but the mail was carried in a special leather blanket. I won't call it a saddle because it was separate from the saddle and it was draped over the saddle. Does anybody know what that leather blanket was called in which they carried mail? I heard it here. Go ahead in the back there in the plaid shirt. Yep, mochila or mochila, depending on how you pronounce it. And again, that was like a leather blanket that was tossed over the saddle, 4 pockets. Pockets were called cantinas. That's where they kept the mail that was being transported. We'll turn quickly to this advertisement for the Pony Express. And this is an endeavor that has certainly captured hearts and imaginations because it was ambitious. It was something that was never done before. And the Pony Express, they were looking for young, skinny, wiry fellows, and orphans were preferred. Orphans were preferred because it was considered such a dangerous job. Think about some of the challenges in our desert environment even today. Extremes in temperature, precipitation, plants and animals that can pose a threat, but also, at that time, there were threats from other humans, and we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. So it was considered a very dangerous job, and they preferred orphans because if a rider was killed performing their work, they weren't leaving behind a family who would miss them and who was potentially financially dependent upon them. The Pony Express was relatively short-lived, 18 months. And it was quickly replaced by a faster form of communication. Anybody know what that form of communication was? Telegraph, excellent. And again, we have a telegraph here to represent that piece of Fort Churchill's history. And the telegraph was also an example of a relay system, required electricity and a lot of the same infrastructure that we find in our own communities today. So wooden poles with wires stretched between them. Those were the wires that carried messages from station to station. Also required the Morse code alphabet. That's what allowed the telegraph operator to create different letters of the alphabet. And so it was these two early forms of communication that allowed those European American immigrants settling in this region to send and receive news and information from around the country. I mentioned the large number of European American immigrants that moved into the area, through and into the area, following the discovery of gold and silver. Well, it's worth pointing out that those European American immigrants were not the first people to call our Great Basin Desert home. Since time immemorial, Nevada's Great Basin Desert has been home to the Northern Paiute, the Western Shoshone, and the Washoe Indians. And when talking about Fort Churchill's history, we're going to focus almost exclusively on the Northern Paiute Indians. They are the ones whose history is interwoven with Fort Churchill. And since time immemorial, the Northern Paiute's lives have been intertwined with the natural resources and the natural seasons and cycles of our desert environment. And with the arrival of this new group of people, this new cultural group, the European American immigrants, tension and conflict began growing as exposure to the other increased. And we have a number of items here on the table that really speaks to this part of Fort Churchill's history. The Northern Paiute, they were and are able to survive and thrive by using all parts of their environment. And you can see examples of that here before you. They repurposed stones and natural materials like reeds and grasses to create tools, to enhance their hunting, to create tools for hunting and gathering. And as more European American immigrants arrived in this environment, those natural resources began disappearing and access to those resources became more limited. And so it threatened the survival and future, those traditional lifeways for the Northern Paiute. So tension and conflict increased as these two cultural groups, their lives grew more and more intertwined. And eventually, this conflict reached a flashpoint. And this occurred in the spring of 1860. And really the catalyst for what would become known as the Pyramid Lake War was a single incident. It is today known as the William Station Incident. And this was the burning of William Station, a trading post, which resulted in the deaths of at least two of the station owners and several of the station employees. And that incident at Williams Station was in response to the kidnapping, the assault, and at least 2 Paiute girls were kidnapped and assaulted, and they were being held captive at Williams Station. Williams Station was a trading post that sat 10 miles northwest of where Fort Churchill was established. Today it sits under the waters of Lake Lahontan. It was operated by 3 Williams brothers, David, James, and Oscar. The eldest Williams brother, James, happened to be away on business, and for reasons that will likely not ever be known to us, those Paiute girls ended up being held captive at Williams Station. And for their families, in the process of rescuing these girls, they burned the station to the ground, killed 2 of the Williams brothers and a handful of employees at the station. Again, this incident became known as the Williams Station incident, and it was the catalyst for a series of 2 battles that were fought in the spring of 1860. First battle was fought in May 12th, 1860, and it was fought between the Northern Paiute Indians and a local militia. In the days following the Williams Station incident, a local militia was formed. They were unofficially led by Major William Ormsby. He was able to rally 105 men, and they began a march from Buckland Station, the area that would become Fort Churchill, north towards Pyramid Lake. And near the southern end of Pyramid Lake, they encountered the Northern Paiute. And an example of the Northern Paiute utilizing their intimate knowledge of the physical landscape to their advantage. They drew the militia into an ambush, and within about 30 minutes, 76 of those 105 militiamen were killed, including their leader, Major William Ormsby. The survivors of that first battle rode back to their communities, and it became the big fish story. Each time they recounted this incident, it grew larger in size, scale, generated a lot of fear, anger, hatred, resentment within the communities. And so this time, those Comstock mining communities demanded military intervention. U.S. Army regulars were dispatched from Fort Alcatraz in California. They were led by Captain Joseph Stewart, and they joined forces with local militia troops. And once again, they began a march north towards Pyramid Lake. And in roughly the same area as that first battle, they engaged with the Northern Paiute Indians for a second time. This was June 2nd, 1860. At the end of the day, when the dust settled, the U.S. Army declared victory. However, the Northern Paiute achieved their objectives. They were anticipating a follow-up battle, and their primary goal was to hold off the troops long enough to allow the women, children, and elders to safely leave the Pyramid Lake area for the Black Rock Desert. However, U.S. Army declared victory after that second battle, and shortly after that second battle, they established Fort Churchill along the banks of the Carson River. And the primary purpose of Fort Churchill, first and foremost, was to protect European American immigrant interests. That included protecting the transportation and communication corridors through this region, the California Trail, the Pony Express, and the Telegraph. They were protecting that infrastructure. A secondary purpose of Fort Churchill was to serve as an aid station. Fort Churchill was eventually located on the western edge of the 40-mile desert. This had a reputation for being one of the most treacherous parts of the California Trail. And so immigrants were quite spent by the time they reached the Fort Churchill area. And the fort provided a place where they could restock, resupply, rest, seek medical care before beginning that final push up and over the Sierra Nevada mountains into California. The officer responsible for finding a suitable location for Fort Churchill was none other than Captain Joseph Stewart, who led that second battle of the Pyramid Lake War. He eventually settled on the area just north of the Carson River, partly because of its proximity to that infrastructure. Fort Churchill was built just south of the California Trail, the Pony Express, and Telegraph route. He also saw the natural resources there along the Carson River, and he thought, aha, a reliable source of wood and water, two things that everybody needs to survive. What he didn't realize is that the trees lining the Carson River are cottonwoods. They like to have their roots wet. They act a bit like a sponge sucking up and retaining water. Pretty challenging to start a fire, to build a structure with soggy wood. So that created a challenge very early on in the life of Fort Churchill, was figuring out how to build a frontier fort in this particular location. In terms of the water, that would also become an early challenge for the soldiers at the fort. In the early years after the discovery of the Comstock lode, the Carson River was heavily contaminated with mercury, a result of mining that was occurring upstream. There were at least 12 mines upstream of Fort Churchill, and all that mercury was ending up in the river. And so construction material and water became two of the earliest challenges faced by the soldiers there at Fort Churchill. They eventually settled on adobe construction, and you can see an example of an adobe brick here. And this was advantageous because all of the materials could be found locally. Sand, water, and clay. They would mix that material on site, press it into brick molds, and allow those bricks to bake out under the sun for at least 14 days. For the first few hundred soldiers living and working at Fort Churchill, that's what they did all day, every day, was mix adobe to make thousands, millions of adobe bricks. Eventually, they were able to construct what would become Fort Churchill. And you can see here, and I will leave all of these items up after the presentation so that you can come and explore them and interact with them. But eventually they were able to construct Fort Churchill, as it's depicted in this drawing here. And this drawing is remarkable because it's the only known image of the fort during its period of operation. Part of what I love about Fort Churchill is its hidden histories. And this drawing happens to represent one of many hidden histories. The artist is a man named Grafton Tyler Brown. He was an African-American artist, map maker, and lithographer. Locally, he is best known for his bird's eye drawings of Virginia City. However, sometime between 1862 and 1864, he visited Fort Churchill, and he captured those physical aspects of the fort. And fortunately for us, he did, because it is the only image that depicts Fort Churchill when the U.S. Army lived and worked there. And Grafton Tyler Brown, I won't spend too much more time on him, but it is worth mentioning. He was an African-American man. He was the son of two freed slaves, originally from Pennsylvania. At a time when black men could not vote, could not own land, he owned his own lithography business in California, in the San Francisco area. On his birth certificate, he was listed as black. On his death certificate, he was listed as white. So a man that was able to pass in our society. But again, just one of many hidden histories that makes Fort Churchill's history so rich and so complex. When you look at this image, you can see exactly how the fort was laid out. There was a large square parade ground in the middle, would have been cleared of all vegetation. This is the space where the soldiers would have lined up each morning for inspection, for roll call, for the assignment of duties, and where they would have participated in any trainings. Along each of the four edges of the parade ground, you would have found the most important structures at the fort. And Fort Churchill was its own community. Each of the buildings had a specific purpose and contributed to the overall success and the daily operation of the fort. The most iconic structures, if you've been to Fort Churchill today, are the officers' quarters, or Officers' Road. This is the northern end of the parade ground. They were the only two-story structures at Fort Churchill. Life at the fort was described as neither truly pleasant or completely intolerable. It was a monotonous rotation of night and day, and certainly one's experience at Fort Churchill probably had everything to do with your rank. We are fortunate to have one diary that was kept by an officer's wife. Her name was Mary Evelyn Chapman, and she was married to Alfred Beck Chapman, Captain Alfred Beck Chapman. And she lived at Fort Churchill for about 6 months in 1861. And she really helps to bring Fort Churchill to life. But it's important to point out that she is writing from that perspective of privilege as an officer's wife. Her experience at Fort Churchill would have been very different from the officers and certainly very different from the enlisted men. But I'll share with you a couple of her entries. She kept a daily diary. There were many days when she wrote, "Nothing much happening." But there were also days when she captures some remarkable things happening at Fort Churchill. March 17th, 1861. She talks about the Irish soldiers getting drunk. And there were a large number of Irish soldiers at Fort Churchill. She talks about a day in January 1861 in which it snowed at the fort. She and her husband, Alfred, they walked down to the river. They had a snowball fight. She didn't manage to hit him. She writes about the day they adopted a dog for their young daughter, Arcadia. Their daughter was only a few months old when they came to live at Fort Churchill. They named their dog Bounce. She talks about the diet of some of the officers, the taffy poles that the officers' families would have, the ice cream socials in which they would make homemade ice cream. So, if you were to read her diary and diary alone, sounds like a pretty fabulous place. And indeed, a lot of the local newspapers described Fort Churchill as the most comfortable fort on the West Coast. Was probably true for the officers, not so much for the enlisted men. Unlike those grand two-story structures that the officers resided in, the enlisted men, they were forced into rather small barracks in which they shared a living space with 49 other men. Each company, and on average, Fort Churchill housed 200 to 300 soldiers. That's the equivalent of 2 to 3 companies, a company being anywhere between 75 and 100 men. Each company was assigned 2 barracks and a mess hall, so each of the barracks buildings could house up to 50 soldiers. A large rectangular space filled with bunk beds. And they did. The enlisted men, they slept 4 to a bed, 2 to each level, head to toe. It wasn't until 1865, after the Civil War, that the enlisted men enjoyed a few luxuries. Whether they had a progressive officer or the War Department had extra money, Fort Churchill received iron bedsteads. So for the first time, the enlisted men were able to sleep 1 to a bed. Some of the other buildings that would grow up around the parade ground included a guardhouse. Order and discipline are and continue to be an important part of Army life, helped to create some structure. Guardhouse, powder magazine, a bakery, a hospital, which represented a luxury for Fort Churchill, storehouses, and commander's office or post headquarters. Those are some of the many structures that popped up around the parade ground. Here on the table representing that piece of Fort Churchill's history, you have lots of symbols depicting the military occupation of Fort Churchill. During the 9 years that Fort Churchill was in operation, it was occupied by a variety of soldiers, as indicated by this cap here. The symbols tell us something about the soldier that would have worn this. That bugle on the top, that would have told us that this young man was part of the infantry. Letter A tells us that he was part of Company A. Fort Churchill had a combination of U.S. Army regulars and Nevada and Civil War volunteers. When Fort Churchill was established, it was staffed by U.S. Army regulars. But shortly after its establishment, the Civil War broke out. And so all of those Army regulars were sent back east to participate in Civil War-related battles. So during that period of time in which the Civil War was being fought, Fort Churchill was staffed by Nevada and California volunteers. After the end of the Civil War, Army regulars returned once again to Fort Churchill. You can also see a bugle. This helped to provide structure, was an important communication tool for the soldiers at the fort. And then, of course, we have some items that allow us to talk a little bit about a soldier's diet at the fort. And we won't spend a lot of time doing that. Rice, beans, hardtack, salt pork, probably not a surprising diet. But Fort Churchill, in addition to housing 200 to 300 soldiers on average, it was a storehouse for the U.S. Army in the West. They kept supplies not only for the men living and working at Fort Churchill, but for soldiers throughout the western United States. So it became an important storehouse or supply depot, generally speaking, for the U.S. Army. But because they were feeding so many mouths, and it was such a rural location, they had to have food items that could be kept in large quantities for an extended period of time without spoiling. And so things like rice and beans were a regular part of their diet. Coffee was the drink of choice. You didn't have many options, water or coffee. Coffee was preferable for a number of reasons. It provided an oftentimes much-needed boost of energy, but it also boosted morale. Imagine a cold winter's day out at Fort Churchill. Maybe there's some snow on the ground, a western wind. That hot cup of coffee could boost their morale. But oftentimes in places like Fort Churchill, the water had a funny taste, a funny color, and a funny odor. And so that coffee would help to disguise those negative qualities associated with local water. Fort Churchill was fortunate that they had fresh beef. They had contracts for many supplies, local contracts for many supplies, including fresh beef, cottonwood, cut-and-cured cottonwood, and hay. At one time, Fort Churchill was home to Nevada's largest cavalry. So in addition to a lot of men, there were a lot of horses at one time too. Fort Churchill was in operation for 9 years. By 1869, the War Department decided Fort Churchill was no longer necessary. And so they packed up their belongings and they abandoned the site. Lots of change had occurred during those 9 years, and all of those changes really did contribute to the demise of Fort Churchill. When Fort Churchill was established, it was part of Western Utah Territory. Nevada didn't become its own territory until 1861. In 1864, Nevada became the 36th state in the Union. Between 1861 and 1865, the Civil War was fought. And then really sort of the final nail in the coffin for the fort was the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. Because the route of that railroad was much further north than Fort Churchill, the soldiers really couldn't provide much of a presence, or they couldn't patrol that rail line. It also made wagon roads like the California Trail obsolete. So the War Department abandoned the site. I mentioned that it was short-lived. When the War Department established Fort Churchill, they were anticipating a much longer occupation. And partly because they were anticipating a prolonged conflict with the Northern Paiute Indians. That conflict did not materialize. After the Pyramid Lake War in 1860, there were never any armed conflicts locally between the Northern Paiute Indians and the U.S. Army. You can also see evidence of a prolonged occupation in the construction of the fort. The original plans for Fort Churchill included 9 officers' quarters. What they ultimately ended up building were 6. Many historians will tell you that they overbuilt Fort Churchill because, again, they were anticipating a much longer occupation within this region. And I suppose I might as well talk about construction costs too while we're on that topic. I did mention that Fort Churchill was Nevada's first largest and most expensive frontier fort. It cost the U.S. Army nearly $180,000 to build Fort Churchill in 1860. That was 10 times the cost of other frontier forts of that time period. And contributing to the cost was the local cost for materials. They were building Fort Churchill just the year after the Comstock lode was discovered near Virginia City. So there was this huge local demand for a limited number of resources. So anything that could not be procured locally had to be sent from California by a horse and wagon. And depending on the time of year, that might be an impossible task, and certainly a costly task anytime. They also employed a large number of civilian laborers at Fort Churchill. By September of 1860, just 2 months after they began construction, they had well over 200 civilian laborers working on constructing the fort. Those civilian laborers were making a lot more money. Depending on their job, they received either $3 or $6 a day, compared to the monthly pay of a private, which was $13 a month. Once the U.S. Army caught wind of the use of civilian laborers, that was fairly short-lived. The last contributing factor was the fact that they largely overbuilt Fort Churchill. They were anticipating housing up to 1,000 soldiers for the duration of the fort, and that those numbers just never materialized. So coming back to the abandonment, 1869, Fort Churchill had outlived its usefulness. Military walked away from the site. They did offer the state of Nevada the land for its appraised value. And Nevada, being a young state at that time, said no thank you. They probably didn't have much money in the coffers. They were only about 5 years old at that point. So the War Department did the next best thing. They auctioned off the buildings. And Fort Churchill's neighbor, a man named Samuel Buckland, bought the buildings at Fort Churchill, not the land, but the buildings. And Samuel came in and he stripped those adobe structures of anything of value, wood, windows, doors, hardware, even some of the adobe brick, and he constructed a big, beautiful, fairly grand home for his family. That house we call Buckland Station today, and it is a part of Fort Churchill. It is a historic house museum that you can visit as part of Fort Churchill. There is an image of Buckland Station as it appears today. A little side note about Samuel Buckland. He predated Fort Churchill. He arrived in the Carson River area in 1858. He was an Ohio native that originally came west with the discovery of gold in California. After spending 7 years failing to strike it rich, he relocated to what was then western Utah Territory, and he set about making a fortune in a much different way. He acquired nearly 1,700 acres in the Fort Churchill area, and he built a one-room tent cabin on his property. His primary source of income was cattle ranching, but he was an enterprising man, an ambitious man, and so he quickly figured out how to provide service while making money. His ranch was at the junction of the California Trail and the Walker-Sonoran Wagon Road, and he capitalized on it. Operated a boarding house, trading post out of his one-room tent cabin. It would also serve as a home station for the Pony Express and the Central Overland Stagecoach. He's also credited with building the area's first and only toll bridge across the Carson River. This would have been his first winter in the area, 1858, 1859. And all of these would have been additional sources of income for him. Samuel eventually met and married his wife Eliza in 1860. They would go on to have 8 children together, only 3 of which survived into adulthood. But just over the years, as their family grew, as their wealth and influence grew, so too did the need for a larger home. So with the abandonment of Fort Churchill came this prime opportunity to get their hands on some pretty valuable materials. And stripped those buildings and incorporated those materials into the home that we call Buckland Station today. Samuel's actions had 2 consequences, one of them more positive than the other. He certainly hastened the decay of Fort Churchill. Once you remove a protective structure from an adobe building, it's only a matter of time before nature reclaims those materials. However, because his house is part of our state park system today, it helps to preserve indefinitely some of those original components of Fort Churchill. After Fort Churchill was abandoned, there was a long period of time in which there was nobody there in a caretaker status. It wasn't until 1925 that the Sagebrush chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution took an interest in Fort Churchill. There was a big nationwide push at that time for the DAR to embrace and to protect and preserve historic sites, and our local chapter took an interest in Fort Churchill. However, they very quickly realized, just physically and financially, it was more than they could take on. But what they ended up doing that was such a tremendous benefit to Fort Churchill was working with the National Park Service in 1935 to bring a Civilian Conservation Corps work camp to Fort Churchill. So for 2 years, 250 young men worked tirelessly to rebuild portions of Fort Churchill. They also built a lot of the infrastructure that we, as visitors to Fort Churchill today, enjoy. Our campground was built in 1935 by the CCC. Our museum was built in 1935 to resemble one of the finished barracks at Fort Churchill. And again, one of those hidden histories, you'll see some charcoal drawings here on the table, and these were done by Elwood Decker. He was part of that Civilian Conservation Corps work camp. His title was camp artist, and his only job was to document what was happening at Fort Churchill in 1935. He could choose the medium, he had to provide his own supplies, but he had to document both the physical landscape, but also the work that the CCC was performing at that time. And so he was there for just a few months, but he created more than 100 drawings, which he sent to Washington, D.C. to capture this moment in Fort Churchill's history. And today we have these wonderful reproductions of some of his drawings that really show not only the physical environment around Fort Churchill in the 1930s, but also the condition, the physical aspects of the fort more than 70 years after the U.S. Army abandoned that site. After the CCC left Fort Churchill, you had another long period in which there was really nobody there in a caretaker status. It wasn't until 1957 that Fort Churchill would get its permanent caretaker, and that is Nevada State Parks. And as an agency, our task is really twofold. It is to preserve and protect the historic resources that make up Fort Churchill today, but also to share that remarkably rich and complex history with visitors. How many of you have been to Fort Churchill? Wonderful, most of you. It comes as no surprise then to hear me say that a visit to Fort Churchill today requires a fair bit of imagination. There are about a dozen structures, which is roughly half of what was built in 1860, but there are about a dozen structures in various states of arrested decay. And really what that means, arrested decay, Fort Churchill will never be rebuilt, just too costly and too time-consuming. But it is our hope that it never looks significantly worse than it does today. And so we're essentially pressing pause on this moment in Fort Churchill's life in terms of the physical aspects of the fort. Fort Churchill inspires many visitors, and it really gets the wheels of their imagination turning. Visitors to the fort today have described the structures as silent sentinels, as ghostly ruins, as skeletal remains. However you describe those remaining adobe walls, Fort Churchill stands as a witness to 163 years of history and also as a stark reminder of how conflict shaped Nevada's early history. So thank you very much for your time and attention this evening.